gets short, try to speak less and not the same amount.
He's so mean to me. That's exactly what I normally do.
For trying to do so.
You know me too well. I'll try. One quick addition. In New Zealand, we also did a time of use case study where we actually had 4 different time of use amounts, and it was from 4 cents a kilowatt hour to 20 cents a kilowatt hour, so it was 5 times the difference. And the evaluation then showed that the control group actually saved the most energy, and the other ones, there was no different whatsoever. So that's just a very good example that price incentives on their own really usually don't work very well, even if it's quite a large difference. Okay, so I'm going to very quickly, but by talking very slowly, give a little bit of an overview of 2 case studies that Ruth and I did in me in New Zealand, her in the Netherlands, and they're quite similar in their ways. So mine was called the PowerCo Smart House Trial. PowerCo is one of the largest Lions companies in New Zealand, and that one has only just started this year, and it's going for another 3 years. They will co-fund the task extension from the New Zealand perspective, so we'll be hearing a lot more about this project. It looks at 3 cities in New Zealand that are geographically and temperature-wise quite varied. It's a pilot project, and it's very much from a DSO's perspective. So it's very much about demand-side management. It's about peak load shifting. It's about how to design tomorrow's network, how to deal with the fact that the gentailers are rolling out smart meters everywhere, how to deal with actually feeding back up to policy to develop the right guidelines and technical standards, and how to deal with the fact that we may actually start breeding prosumers depending on if we would have gotten the Green Party in this election, which unfortunately we didn't. I was a candidate. There would have been a big subsidy on solar water heating and PVs, for example, thereby creating more of the prosumer idea in New Zealand, which we don't have right now. It was based on neoclassical economics, the usual rational human, but it was also based on energy cultures, which is our New Zealand experts research project, which actually is a way of framing the different cultures and segmenting them. It's also based on technological innovation systems and transition theory, and it's very much the thought of moments of change, which I was talking about a little bit earlier, which is that if you retrofit a house with a whole lot of technology, that's a really good time to get people to start rationally thinking about energy use and how they interact with appliances, which normally is just a habitual routine thing. So the moments of change concept was very important. Now a little bit of a wider context, New Zealand has 80% renewable electricity. We do have a lot of DSM issues. We're a long country, as you can see. This is where Auckland is, which is 1/3 of our population, and this is where all the hydro lakes are. And as you can see, we're 2 islands, and there is a very shonky cable connecting the 2 islands that is transferring the hydro from down there to the main population centres up north. So demand-side management and peak load issues are quite an important issue in New Zealand. We now also have legislation that actually requires the distribution companies to be energy efficient, but it doesn't tell them how, and nobody has tested it. So they're kind of currently going, what are we going to do with this legislation? And then of course there is a smart meter rollout, and like every other country we're looking at smart grids somewhere down the line. So, just some findings. Piloting smart home technology is a good way of establishing technological potential. It is a very good way to engage customers because they did become incredibly interested in their energy consumption and really started thinking about what they were using and how, and some of them went from being entirely disengaged and not at all into any kind of environmental or even monetary savings to being incredibly vigilant and becoming mavens, and they called themselves mavens, and being the knowledge distributors among their friends. So that was very good. It was definitely a first step to creating smart prosumers, because a lot of them, even though, especially the men in the households, were very skeptical of PV, when they had it and they saw the feedback of the PV production, in New Zealand there is no feed-in tariff, so they realised very quickly that they could only get 7 cents a kilowatt hour savings if they sold it back into the grid, but they could get 28 cents an hour kilowatt savings if they actually consumed it themselves. And so they started very vigilantly dealing with the interaction and the feedback from their PV systems. It was definitely a way to change lifestyles and break some habits, particularly because of that interaction with their PV system. And it was a good way to showcase best practice before rolling it out any further, because this is a very small pilot. There were some very important lessons on consumer service perspective for the Lions company, because they're not directly involved with consumers. So they don't usually have the consumer service perspective in mind at all, but just actually doing this, and it was with our own employees, and still they realized that they had to change their communication, for example, to not really piss people off. It was not statistically meaningful to quantify impacts because we only had 3 houses. It is definitely not a straightforward demand-side management tool, because you're wrangling a hell of a lot of technology and you're wrangling consumer perspectives, and not all of that is that mature yet and that easily to deal with. It's not technologically fully matured, and it's not easily replicable on the national scale. And everyone that I've talked to who's doing smart grid pilots around the world has very similar feedback as well. They're saying this is not, smart grid is not yet ready to be rolled out, because it's not really technologically mature enough, particularly not in the engagement and interaction with the customer. And if you forget the customer in a smart grid rollout, you get some really terrible horror stories, like when women have to get up a quarter of an hour early every morning because the washing machine only washes during the night, and you know the clothes would get wrinkly and smelly otherwise, and so they have to give up the morning lie-in, and that's not a good way of keeping your customers happy. So the Power Matching City project in the Netherlands, which Ruth did, that was a pilot running from 2007 to 2011, and now it's in the evaluation phase. It was in 2 cities in the Netherlands. It cost several million euros because it had a lot more houses involved. And it was also about testing the integral smart grid with innovative appliances, and they actually went one step further than the New Zealanders, because they really put in smart washing machines and disaggregated feedback. And they had a project called Washing When the Sun is Shining, so it really was about connecting the appliances with the PV. They also had a consortium of stakeholders from different areas, both from the technology developers and the DSOs and research and ICT. It was very much geared at early movers, so like the New Zealand pilot, which was geared at the employers from the company. This one was also geared at people who were already incredibly engaged and had energy neutral communities started up that they were a part of. Variable pricing was a part of it, which the New Zealand one was as well. And this one did something really well, which the New Zealand one hasn't done yet, which is like very much work on co-creating the feedback and the type of feedback and the right way of feeding back the information with the end users. It was also based on neoclassical economics, but they did very much understand that there was no homo economicus in energy. They used gamification methodology, which we just heard some examples from Anton. It was very much about participatory learning, which is really important, and co-creation. So it had a very strong social element to it. And the context was that also the technical system wasn't mature yet, and that these energy communities that these people were chosen from had already existed. So piloting smart home technology in Holland was a good way of establishing the technological potential. It became very important to match technology to consumer needs. It was a first step to creating smart prosumers and communities in that sense, because it went further than just the individual households. And it was a very good lesson that communities do offer scalability. So if you go at it rather than household per household, you go at already established transition town communities or energy communities. That is a much better way of rolling out something like that than trying to go to individual households. It was a good way to embed trust and transparency, and they had to struggle with that quite a bit. And again, they had some very important lessons on the consumer service perspective, which normally DSOs, as I said, don't really think about that much. And that became particularly obvious in the importance of co-creating the feedback. It was not easy to make the technology match the real life needs. The example I just said before of the washing machine is a good one. It was not a way to change individual behaviour. And The technology, again, wasn't fully matured yet. And there was issues around trusts, as it always seemed that the commercial interests would get in the way of doing what is exactly right for the consumer in the end. And we had the same issue with the New Zealand one as well. And it definitely became apparent that it's never a good idea to ignore frustrations or frustrated voices. And so the common learnings and lessons from the two of them is it really is all about the people. But it's very important to not look at them as individuals, because the wider communities, and especially the families, are really important. You always have one person in a household that is self-selecting for these kind of pilots, that's incredibly technically aware and astute and really wants to play with the technology and loves to get into the feedback and into remote controls. It's usually the man in the household that we found. But then they have to deal with teenage daughters who don't want to stop taking half-an-hour showers, or to sons who don't want to play PlayStation all night. And that suddenly becomes a whole lot more difficult to do these kind of things. And that really needs to be understood. There are very big differences even within the households, and we found, in both countries we found that there were very interesting gender differences. Like, for example, the men were very sceptical of the PV. The women thought it was a really nice idea because it was using, the sun, which is already free, and they were much more positive about that. The men were really keen on the technology and playing with the widgets and the feedback and the remote control. The women didn't really care about it, although they did when the men made it so that their afternoon TV turned off in the middle of Jerry Springer that she was watching, and he didn't tell her for 3 days how to turn it back on, that she could just turn it on the TV. It caused some household political issues there. And what we found with the women was that they were very happy to give up control to the DSO to turn off washing machines or dishwashers or turn them on at peak time, low times. But, and the men not so keen. They wanted to program it themselves and actually figure out how, because they thought they knew better. But what the women didn't let them do at all was touch the heating. And I was always very impatient. Do not touch my heating blanket. Do not touch my electric blanket, ever. Do not touch my heat pump. I don't want some company outside deciding when to turn on or off my heat pump. So, trust really was everything, and both companies found that it was difficult to gain but very easily lost by not listening to some of the concerns. It was also very important to actually present a human face and an intermediary that they knew was the same one, because with these technology projects there's usually a lot of different people coming into the house and installing different types of technology. That can become quite annoying if there is not one access person that they can really interact with. And it's okay to be technical. They're usually quite interested in it and want to learn, but don't be technocratic. Don't impose the technology on them and treat them as if they just don't touch any buttons. We heard that before. And it's very much about learning how to communicate differently. And then it was also important to balance the research needs with the user needs. We had an example in New Zealand where for the Lions company, it was all about peak load shaving. It wasn't about energy conservation. They were not interested in that. And so when I did the behavioural interviews, when I talked to the end users and I said to them, they had this fancy new water system. It was spectacular, with all sorts of bells and whistles involved with the PV and God knows what. But it didn't have an insulation around it. It didn't have it wasn't insulated. And so I said, why isn't your hot water heating insulated? And they were like, why would it need to be? And I was like, well, a fair bit of heat gets lost in that. And then I asked the company and they said, oh, but we're not interested in conservation, we're only interested in peak load shaving. And so when I fed that back to the consumers, they got really angry about that, because our bloody researchers, they only want to do what they're interested in, not what we are interested in. And so it's very important not to do that. And it's also important to talk about lifestyle, not just about the technology. And it's also important to listen to the frustrated or the laggards or the people who say no, because they usually have very, very, very good reasons why they say no, and you don't want to ignore them. It's very much ignoring them at your peril. And you'll find that if you actually address problems and conflicts straight on, there is a lot more goodwill coming back in terms of finding solutions for it. And the co-creation and shared learnings are very important. So that's this example from New Zealand and the Netherlands. Thank you.